We are just delighted today to welcome our own, that is Korbel graduate, or GSIS graduate, 1980, General George W. Casey Jr. General Casey has done just about everything you can do in today's and even yesterday's military. But General Casey, I think we first met at having dinner with Slobodan Milosevic. So I think that kind of covers it all.
Yeah, right.
General Casey was the 36th Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army from 2007 to 2011 and led an operation that's arguably more complex than the Korbel School, with something on the order of $200 billion annual budget. 1.1 million people, truly one of the most complex organizations on the face of the earth. And prior to that, General Casey was from 2004 to 2007, he commanded the multinational force Iraq, which in addition to commanding U.S. troops, he commanded troops from some 29 other countries. And not easy to do. One can understand why Napoleon once said, "My greatest strength is that I have no allies." In fact, to deal with 30 different countries, all of whom have their sort of national exceptions, etc., was quite an active diplomacy. And so I think we have in our midst really someone who has served our country with great distinction, who is, arguably as well one of the most beloved American soldiers. Whose our country has had the privilege to observe in the last 20, 30 years. General Casey, I could go on about you, your sense of humor is certain here, but I think everyone came here not to hear me, but to hear you.
Okay, great.
So welcome.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. Hello. How are you, Arthur? Nice to see you. Well, great to be back with you here. And I was thinking about this coming up here, 1980. You're probably wondering how I even made it here. But if your 30 years after leaving here are as wild as mine, you are in for a hell of a time. And I think the world that you're entering, that you're living in now, but you'll be entering at a different level when you leave here, is going to be fascinating. And it's going to be full of opportunities, and it's also going to be full of some very, very significant challenges. And not that I'm a pessimist, but I'm going to talk today about the security side of things and the international security environment as I see it in the next decade or so. And frankly, it'll be a little more pessimistic than some of the other segments of society that you could talk about. But you're living in a fascinating time. I guess that's the old Chinese proverb, right? May you live in fascinating times. Well, you got it. What I'd like to do is give you a soldier's view of the international security environment. And it's a view that's born and shaped by really a decade at war. I got to the Pentagon as the Director of Strategy and Policy in October of 2001. And I've been involved in the war in one form or another, to include the time in Iraq ever since then. And I've also been involved significantly in a decade of transformation, because we had very, very good and capable armed forces on September 11th, but they were very, very good and capable at doing large armored battles on the plains of Europe or on the deserts of Saudi Arabia. Not what we needed them to do. And so we had to transform on the fly in the middle of a war. And I will tell you, nothing is transformative as a war. Because when you're trying to change, when people's lives are at stake, you're absolutely committed to doing it as quickly and as well as you can. So I want to talk to you then about how I see the security situation from here. First of all, I begin with a view that we're not only at war today, we've been at war for a decade. And we're at war with a global extremist network that attacked us successfully on our soil and continues to try to attack us here at home every day. And there's a trial going on right now for one of those terrorists that tried to do that. And so that's a challenge for us. And on the one hand, our armed forces are very, very seasoned and committed, they're also stretched by the last decade. I mean, when you think about it, just in the Army, we've lost over 4,000 soldiers, and they've left over 20,000 family members. We've had over 25,000 soldiers wounded, 8,000 of which were wounded significantly enough to require long-term care. It was Lincoln was the one who said it's a national imperative to take care of those who have borne the burden, and we can never take our eye off that. And we're only a month. Today's the 11th, so we're a month away from the 10th anniversary of September 11th, and we're just days away from the 10th anniversary of the war in Afghanistan. We've been at this for a long time. And as I launch into this view of what the world might look like, I do it with great humility, because I'm a great subscriber to the old Yogi Berra adage, predictions are hard, especially when you're talking about the future. I've learned a lot of things in 41 years in the military, and especially in the last 10, and one thing I have learned is we don't do well in predicting the future. We're human beings. And I was bemoaning that fact to Alan Greenspan one night over dinner, and he looked at me and laughed, and he said, "General, economists are no better." And so as I talk about this, I do it with humility. It's probably wrong. It will probably change. But it's a view of someone who's been at this for a decade or so. Against that backdrop of the fact of us entering the second decade of a war, and it's a different kind of war, and it certainly hasn't produced the casualties of the world war, of the conventional wars that we saw in the 20th century. It is different. When you think 4,000 soldiers killed is a lot, but in 10 years of war, if you go back and compare that to other wars, it's relatively small. But against that backdrop, then I look at the trends that are out there in the international environment. And it seems to me that the trends that I see are more likely to exacerbate the fact that we're at war, and the fact that it's a long-term ideological struggle that's going to go on for a while. And so I think the next decade is going to be more of the same, maybe not on the scope and scale of Iraq and Afghanistan, but of uncertainty and uncertainty at home. I was interviewed for a newspaper who was doing kind of a retrospective on September 11th, and they asked me what I was doing. And I was down in a command south of Washington, and I told them the thing that struck me the most is as soon as I found out what had happened, I started calling around after my sisters-in-law who worked in the World Trade Center. And it struck me that for years, I'd probably been in the service by about 25 years by then, they were calling after me when something happened in Egypt or something happened in Kosovo or Bosnia where I was stationed. And the whole thing was just turned around. Here I'm asking about civilians in the United States, are they okay? And that really, really stuck with me. So anyway, let's take a look at some of these trends. And the trends are positive and negative, but I think as I take the sum total of this, they're more likely to make for a more difficult decade coming up here than not. Globalization, first trend. There's no question that globalization is bringing prosperities to countries around the globe. No question. The Economist tracks 42 economies around the world. I read in the last week or two that of the top 20 economies that have a growth rate of 3% or better, only 2 of them are what you could consider established economies, Sweden and Austria. The rest are emerging economies. That's a good thing. But there's still a lot of have-nots out there, a lot of have-not countries. When you think about the fact that 70% of the world's wealth is controlled by 20% of the world's population, and that the bottom 45% of the world's population controls only 5% of the world's wealth. And there's still several billion people out there that are getting by on less than $2 a day. That's a long-term problem for us. And those populations of those have-not countries, I believe, are much more susceptible to recruiting by extremist organizations. The other thing that's happening out there is obviously we're becoming more connected. The economies of the world are becoming more connected, and you can see that every day as the stock markets follow the sun and react to what's going on in one or the other. And we've seen a huge jump in the numbers of multinational corporations in the last decade. I mean, from about 3,000 a decade ago to 60,000 now. That's an awful lot. And about 50 of those multinational corporations are in the top 100 economic entities in the world. The other 50 are countries. That to me seems to present a significant challenge when we start bringing non-state actors into the economic discussions. That's going to be a long-term challenge for us. So globalization, double-edged sword, certainly having positive impacts, but also going to have some significant negative impacts. And you're all watching the economy just like I am, or maybe not just like I am. My 401ks are just in the tank. But that's going to present obviously some very additional frictions here over time. The second trend that's also a double-edged sword is the technological growth. And there's no question that technology is bringing knowledge to anyone who's got a cell phone or computer, and that's a hugely positive thing. And when you think about the fact that right now there was a UN report came out earlier this year that said there's 2 billion internet users right now. That's almost a third of the world's population are out there surfing the net. Again, a good thing. And about 5 billion cell phone users out there. When you think about those cell phones, by 2025 are going to have the same computing power as your current laptop. That's a good thing. But that same computing power and that same access will be used by terrorist organizations to export terror around the world. So good news and bad news. The other little tidbit I saw the other day is Facebook is over 800 million users, and 75% of those are outside the United States. I was talking to Chris earlier, and I was thinking about this today as I was coming up, and we were both involved in the Balkans together, and I wondered how different the Balkans might have been if the people in Sarajevo or the people in Srebrenica had iPhones with cameras. I mean, one of the positive aspects of that is look what it's done to the levels of violence and the ability to mobilize international media in support of populations. I mean, that's a very positive thing. The other thing that's happening with technology is a lot of technologies that used to be the exclusive purview of states, like satellite imagery and surveillance capability, it is now available to anybody that can afford it. I mean, there used to be 8 or 9 countries that could launch satellites. That's expanding. There's about 50 states and non-state actors that have access to satellite imagery. And the more that's up there, the more people can leverage what's available on commercial satellites for negative purposes. And then the last bit of technology here is that we all need to pay much closer attention to the cyber threat. I mean, you talk to the folks at the National Security Agency, they won't tell you what they can do and what they can't do. But they say, an assumption they make is we believe that our opponents can do everything that we can do. And if that scared me to death. That's a real challenge. And there's a firm called McAfee that does internet security, and they put a report out a little bit ago that said that they estimated that 120 states are using the internet for espionage purposes, for political, military, and economic purposes. Those are the states. What are the guys in the basements doing? So technology, another double-edged sword, and can create additional friction for us as we go forward. Demographics. Demographics is another trend that I think is going in the wrong direction, can have some significant negative impact. I've seen studies that show that the populations of some of these developing countries is expected to double in the next decade, and that will bring with that an accompanying youth bulge. And when you think about the fact that today 60% of the population in the Middle East is under 25, and in 2/3 of the country of the world, in 1/3 of the countries in the world, 2/3 of their populations are under 30. And if you link that back to the economic challenges that we're talking about in some of these countries, the risk of large, unemployed, disenfranchised youth can create a real problem both for the host country and for recruiting by the extremist organizations. The other demographic challenge is the increasing urbanization around the world. By 2030, I've seen estimates that say that 60% of the world's population is going to live in cities. And that creates huge problems for governments, but it also has significant implications for where our military is going to have to operate. You know, Jim Rainey down here in the front row fought his battalion through the city of Najaf, through the back alleyways of the city of Najaf in 2004. And I think he'll tell you over a cup of coffee that that was one of the most challenging things that he ever had to do. Operating in cities for the military is very, very difficult. And lastly, the increasing population growth obviously is going to create an increased demand for resources. And the middle classes in both China and India are already larger than the populations of the United States. So that's an awful lot of two-car families that need the resources. So demographics, a trend I think definitely pushing us in the wrong direction. I'll call this a trend, and it's one I think the jury is still out on, and that's the so-called Arab Spring. And as I look at what's happened there over the course of this year, and I look at my experience in Iraq, helping build democracy in a country without an established government and an established economy, I can just tell you it's messy business. And I think back to the January of 2005 when we had the first elections there in Iraq. You remember the purple fingers? The folks walking around showing everyone their finger. And one of my most favorite stories from that day was my sergeant major was out at a polling station and he ran into a 70-year-old man. And he was proudly showing his finger. And he said, well, how do you feel? What do you think about today? And the Iraqi said, today, for the first time in my life, I feel alive. Now, we can never forget the power of democracy. But that said, as good as that felt, it didn't put money in his pocket, food on his table, or electricity in his refrigerator. And I watched several Iraqi governments struggle mightily with that while they were trying to implement a democratic process. And it's especially difficult when you have a situation like Iraq where a portion of the country of the population has been excluded from governance for a decade or so. I mean, you have the Shia population, they basically weren't involved in government in any significant way for over 30 years. And so, but yet now they were the ones that were trying to run the country. It's messy business. And my view is it'll get worse before it gets better, and it's going to take 5 to 10 years before it sorts itself out. And as much as I'd like to see it done faster, I think that's just the reality of it. The two trends that I think that scare me the most are weapons of mass destruction and safe havens. On weapons of mass destruction, there's about 1,000, probably a few more now, known terrorist organizations around the world, and we know that a good number of them are actively seeking weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, biological. And there's no doubt in my mind that when they get their hands on one, they'll attempt to use it against the developed country. And I don't think that is too far off. I've been saying 5 years for 4 years, even before it came up on 24. But I think 3 to 5 years. It's going to happen. It's unfortunate, but it's going to happen. And that will change us again forever. Safe havens. Countries or parts of countries where the local governments can't or won't deny their country to terrorist organizations. And if you think about it, we always ask ourselves, okay, well, is what's going on in Yemen, for example, is that in our national interest? Should we get involved? Well, when you have that as a home of a terrorist organization that's actively planning and launching suicide attackers in the United States, I think we have to care. I think it is in our national interest. And so we'll have to pay much, much closer attention to ungoverned spaces as we go forward here. And then lastly, it's not really a trend, but I don't think any discussion of the international security environment would be complete without a discussion of what I call the perennials and the rogues. And the perennials being those long-term festering problems that can spike at any time and usually spike at the worst possible time. Israel-Palestine, India-Pakistan, China-Taiwan, those places around the world that are, North Korea, South Korea. They're festering, they're intractable problems, and like I said, they can blow up in any possible time. And then the rogues. Countries like Iran and North Korea that are state sponsors of terrors and proliferators of weapons of mass destruction. There's no doubt in my mind that what we're seeing on the play out in the news today about the Quds Force trying to put a plot together against the Saudi ambassador to the United States, and Iranians say, "Come on, us? Absolutely us." There's no doubt in my mind that they're working, in countries like Iran and North Korea are working covertly to leverage those kinds of things against us. And so when you wrap all that together, what I see is a decade or so where, one, we'll be at war, I think, for another 10 years or so. Again, not necessarily at the levels we've been at. It'll take a while for this ideological struggle to play out, and the trends I just talked about are more likely to exacerbate what's going on than to ameliorate it. And what I see is an unstable but connected world in which the instruments of catastrophic damage are no longer the exclusive purview of states. And I think that's a problem. Now, this interconnected but unstable world is not something I came by myself. There's a wonderful book out there that some of you may have read called The Age of the Unthinkable by a young guy, Joshua Ramo. And it's a short book. I mean, it's not like one of Arthur Gilbert's texts. It's one you can knock out here pretty quickly. And what he postulates is that we are in a connected but unstable world. And he uses the analogy of sand coming through an hourglass. And you have the sand pile at the bottom, where all the grains of sand are connected but not stable. And as the grains come down from the top, one grain can unhinge the whole sand pile and it all falls apart. And you never know which one that's going to be. And he says that's kind of where we're headed. And as I thought my way through it and I looked at these trends, it seems to me increasingly likely that that's where we're headed. And when you look at what's happening is that since we are so connected, that when bad things happen, they're much more different and much more complex than we're used to. And all us old gray-haired folks, we're trying to take our knowledge of what we did in the past and trying to apply them to these hugely different problems. And those solutions, I think I'm not an economist, but what I see going on with the economic situation in the United States is I think there's a lot of old think going on, and we're trying to apply old solutions to new problems. But that's what you all will deal with, and the problems are only going to get harder. The other element of these instruments of catastrophic damage, not any longer just the purview of states. If you think back to what happened in southern Lebanon in the summer of 2006, here you have Hezbollah, a non-state actor, operating inside a state, Lebanon, supported by two other states, Syria and Iran, and fighting yet another state, Israel. And Hezbollah, a terrorist organization, has the instruments of state power. They started off the war with over 10,000 rockets and missiles, and not just the little ones that they used to shoot at us in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the large missiles that they shot at Israeli cities. It's a terrorist group threatening population centers. And they used unmanned aerial vehicles to get the targets right for those missiles. And they had state-of-the-art anti-tank guided missiles that they mixed with improvised explosive devices to attack the Israeli army forces. 40% of the Israeli casualties came from those anti-tank guided missiles. State-of-the-art from Iran. They had state-of-the-art surface-to-air missiles that they used to shoot down Israeli helicopters. And they had state-of-the-art cruise missiles that they sunk in an Israeli corvette in the Mediterranean Sea. I mean, a terrorist organization. Oh, by the way, they also got their message out on local television. That's a different ballgame. That's happened. That happened in 2006. It can happen other places and happen again. And so what I believe then, all those trends and the fact that we're all taken together, I believe we're in for a decade or so of what I call persistent conflict. Protracted confrontation among states and non-state actors who are increasingly willing to use violence to accomplish their political and ideological objectives. And while the violence, again, won't necessarily be like World War II or World War I, it'll be out there, it'll be steady, and we'll all feel threatened occasionally, even in our homes. And I think that's a problem. And so that's the situation that faces us, and as we're also facing that with a military that is looking hard at the need to continue to change to stay up with evolving threats, and at the same time be part of this reduction in our overall government spending that has led to these huge deficits. And we're doing that at a time, we've historically done it after wars were over. We're doing it now at a time that we're not done with the war. And that's something we just need to be very careful about. Now, let me shift gears just for a second and talk a little bit about how I see the nature of war evolving over this period. And I will tell you, and I say this a lot, but I spent the first 30 years of a 40-year career training to fight a war I never fought. In the last 10 years, learning to fight a different form of war while I was fighting it. But that's the bane of the military's existence, and it's not just the military's problem. As I said, you can't predict the future. You take your best shot, but if you get an 85% solution, hallelujah. Then you only have to figure out how to make up the other 15%. We were probably better than 50% off, and so we had some major catching up to do. And so we've learned a lot from Iraq and Afghanistan, but we're trying to do it through a broader lens, because we don't want to repeat the old military malaise of organizing ourselves to do well in Iraq and Afghanistan, to do well in the last war, not the next war. And so we've looked hard at what that might look like. But a couple of elements of that future environment. One is diverse actors. You know, we spent centuries with states fighting states. And we developed conventions and laws of land warfare to govern the conduct of those battles. When you're fighting a non-state actor, they don't have those rules. They don't have to play by any rules, and they don't. And that's problematic. And the other element with non-state actors, it's sure hard to deter a non-state actor because they really have nothing visible that you can hold hostage. I mean, you might be able to find something, but it doesn't stick right out and catch it in the face. The second element of the future of warfare, I think, is more what we call hybrid threats. I think the likelihood of state-on-state conflict is fairly remote. I mean, folks might miscalculate and something will happen, but the likelihood of state-on-state conflict is increasingly remote. And the likelihood of a nuclear exchange is even more remote than that. And so what I think we're more likely to see are these hybrid threats that will be conventional, irregular, criminal, terrorist capabilities, all arrayed against us differently and asymmetrically to counter our strength, to counter our overwhelming firepower. It's a little bit about what you saw in Lebanon. I mean, that was 3,000 Hezbollah operatives basically denied 30,000 well-equipped, well-trained Israelis their objectives. That's kind of a hybrid threat. And again, as I said, most states, if they're going to take us on, they're not going to take us on head on. One of the first things they teach you in military school is you don't put your strength against the enemy's strength. You put it against their weakness. So folks are going to come at us where we don't have overwhelming power. The third element, I think conflicts, one because of the population growth and urbanization, but two, because of the enemy's desires, it's going to be fought in and among the population. And they'll do that to take advantage of their local knowledge and their cultural knowledge, and also to limit the effectiveness of our ability to come after them. I can remember when you hear a lot about the drone strikes in Pakistan now, but we were doing a rudimentary version of that in Fallujah in 2004 because we couldn't get into the city because the terrorists controlled it. And over time, we the country, got better at doing that. And so we have to continue to develop capabilities to do that. But I think about how hard it was to look inside a compound, inside a building which you couldn't see into, and to figure out whether you had a terrorist in there or a family. And as hard as that was, trying to do it in a high-rise apartment building inside our city, where there were 200 or 300 apartments in one building, was even harder. And again, the fact that the people, they got cameras, they got cell phones, and they can move information very quickly around the world, it just makes it a tougher nut. And it's not entirely a negative thing, because I do think it will cause anybody involved, almost anybody involved in war, to play down or to work actively to mitigate the violence against civilians. I think we're going to have to work closely with indigenous and interagency partners in the military. I mean, time and again you've heard that we're not going to win in Iraq and Afghanistan by military means alone. And especially when we're dealing with populations, it's the political stability, it's the representativeness of the government, and economic opportunity that need to be created for long-term security and stability. And so the military is going to have to continue to work with both the local partners and with our interagency partners to build those. And then lastly, the global media is a fixture of the international environment. It's a fixture of the future of warfare. And again, not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if the international media had access, more access than they had in Sarajevo and Srebrenica, those things may not even have happened. But on the other hand, it's something that we have to continually deal with to tell our side of the story. So bottom line, it's not getting any easier. And when I think about the challenges I faced as a young officer, the biggest challenge was trying to figure out where the second echelon of the Russian attacking Russian hordes was. And so actually, when you think about it, finding the 8th Guards Tank Army is a heck of a lot easier than finding a terrorist on the 18th floor of a high-rise apartment building. And so for us in the military, it places a huge premium on leadership and building and growing the leaders that can operate in these environments. So again, against all of that, persistent conflict, the nature of war fundamentally changing, and it will continue to change. I believe it's not just in the military side, but our whole world, that we are in a period of fundamental and continuous change. And it's just going to continue to change. So we have a military that has been stretched by a decade of war, but is seasoned. That continues to be one of the most professional elements of our society. But they're getting ready to go into the second decade of a war and a fiscal environment where we know that we are going to have to get smaller and get more efficient with the resources that we're given. And I will just tell you that as we go through that, we have to be very, very careful. Shai Meyer, one of my predecessors as Chief of Staff of the Army, went to Congress in 1980 and said, the Army's hollow. And that was a significant statement and a significant revelation. Now, Fortunately, he had the good sense to go to Camp David the weekend before and tell the president that he was going to say that. But in 1980 was 7 years after the last combat battalion left Vietnam. And so what happens is you get hollowed out incrementally over time. And you don't get the one huge cut that everybody says, okay, you know you can't do that. You get a lot of little cuts that you figure out how to deal with. And you feel pretty good about it at the end of your watch when you leave and move on. But it keeps happening. And all of a sudden somebody like Scheimeyer gets there and looks around and goes, holy mackerel, we're hollow. And it took 7 years. And what I worry about is we're in a decade of persistent conflict. We can well turn around in 5 to 7 years and not be capable of dealing with the challenges that are confronting the country. And so that's just another element of complexity we have to deal with as we deal with the huge economic challenges that the country faces. And with that, I think I'll stop and take your questions. But just to kind of wrap it all up, at war, been at war for a decade. The trends on top of that are likely to lead us into another decade or so of persistent conflict. And we have to be very, very careful how we balance the guns and butter arguments. Otherwise, we'll wind up with we'll unhinge a military that's the best in the world at what it does in about 5 to 7 years. And with that, I will stop, and I will be happy to take your questions about anything you want to talk about. There you go.
Sir, you were talking about the need to engage with local populace, the ability for the military to actually get out and do that, and the complexities of that. So one of the new efforts that the military is doing is female engagement teams. And I wonder,
You saw the news the other night? Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could talk to the fact that you have to embed female engagement teams with combat arms because there are no women in combat arms or special forces. Do you see that ban being lifted? And if so, is the current ban cultural, or is there a legitimacy and capabilities going on?
That's a great question. I mean, it was one of the last questions I got asked by a reporter as I was walking out of my job as Chief of Staff of the Army. And with great courage, I looked him in the eye and said, that's General Dempsey's problem. I don't, first of all, I think female engagement teams are a combat multiplier. And we wouldn't ever there wouldn't be enough of them that we'd ever get to a point where we could put them one in every unit. So we put them where they were needed on the battlefield in small numbers. The heart of your question is, will we ever get to the point where we have women in combat arms units? And I'm not trying to pin my successors down to anything, but I think absolutely we will. But it may take some time. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. I mean, I believe we'll get through the implementation of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I think it's gone fairly well, and I think some more social change needs to be made. I think it could be addressed, but I don't think it'll happen in the next year or two. But I think it will happen over time. I think it should happen over time. In the back.
In the current budget crisis, it's looking sort of like every agency for himself. Since you don't have to worry about making sure the Army gets its cut of the pie, if you could issue advice to the Joint Chiefs and everyone sort of budget for state and everything, what would you
I tell you, it's a problem. It's a huge problem. I used to rail at my guys inside the Army to get out of their silos, to think about help me run the Army and not just worry about what's good for their own silos. Because when you're in silos, the requirements and the needs, they only go one way. They go up. And what I realized shortly after my tenure, getting into the job, was that I was a silo for the Secretary of Defense. And here's something that happened, and this is a true story. So I'm in my office one day early in my tenure, and the budget guys come in. We have a big Department of Defense budget meeting the next day where they're going to approve it's probably the 2010 budget. It was going to go forward to Congress. And they all come running in and say, they just cut us $5 billion. The world will end. We'll we won't be able to do anything. It's like, oh, okay, I got to go fight for the team. So so the next day, we go to this big meeting. We're all sitting around the table, and it was, these meetings are usually pro forma. So we get to the point where they say, okay, anybody have any problems? And I felt like Oliver Twist, I'm asking for more. And I said, Mr. Secretary, you cut us $5 billion, da, 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 da. Complete silence. Nobody says a word. And the briefer goes, next slide. And I said, excuse me. And the Secretary of Defense says, okay, George, I heard you. So the next day I get a call. He said, okay, they gave us back $3 billion. So I get the team back in. I said, sorry, guys, I did my best, and all I could get was $3 billion. And they said, oh, that's okay. I said, what? You told me the world was going to end. And after that, I took a very jaundiced view of what they were asking me to do, and I looked very hard at what they were doing. But what will happen in a big bureaucracy like the department is everybody will look at their budgets and they'll try to keep all the programs that they have and just figure out how to do them smaller and smaller numbers. I think the significance of the cuts coming at us, we have to fundamentally rethink what we're doing in terms of a strategy. And we have to let our civilian leaders know what they're buying. We can take $200 billion cuts, but what that means is you're going to have much less capability to do what you want it to do. And we as the military have to we have to make that linkage, because what will happen is we'll take small cuts and try to make do, and we'll wind up 7 years down the road not where we want to be. And the other thing, and General Dempsey knows this, we talked before he took over the job, but this is the time to go back and do what Colin Powell did way back when and say, look, here's kind of a base force that the United States of America needs to face the challenges of the next decade or two, okay? And get the service chiefs there at the table, get them to agree on that, and then have them take it forward. But that won't happen at a level below the service chiefs. It will take the chairman bringing the service chiefs together to make that happen. But that's what needs to happen.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thanks for being here. A short time ago, you were sitting where we are, and
Now there's a guy that has a worse time perspective than me.
my question is quite simply, what do you wish you knew going into your professional life that you can share with us as we go into ours?
One of the things that was always going through my mind as I was here going through the different courses, there are days say, am I really ever going to use this? Will I ever really need to reach back and grab this? And so I took a bunch of courses on the Soviet Union with Jonathan Edelman. And 6 months after I left here, I was sitting on the Suez Canal with just myself and 3 Russian officers. Now this is 1981, middle of the Cold War. I mean, just to give you an idea of the tensions just in that room. We took turns cooking. The first night I cooked, they wouldn't take a bite of their food until I did. That's the level of trust. And so we would, after several vodkas, debate the merits of communism and capitalism. But I was armed by Jonathan. I found myself, taking Arthur's course, How Wars Start, How Wars End. And I'm involved in the run-up to the Kosovo War and watching the country go through the decision to go to war there. And I did it again in Iraq. And then I got the sequel, How Wars End. And I wound up with Chris and Richard Holbrooke and Strobe Talbot negotiating the end of the Kosovo War. And actually, as a military officer, my division wound up implementing the treaty that I helped negotiate with the Russians and with the Serbs. And so I said to myself, wow, there was a heck of a lot more from the experience here than I would have thought at the time. So I just tell you, get into everything that you can. And it's not necessarily the specific things that you're learning, it's the breadth of experiences that you'll have. And you got to have a base. Because once you, Henry Kissinger used to say this, once you get into government, You trade on your intellectual capital. You don't build intellectual capital in government. They suck it out of you. And so you're here to build intellectual capital that will serve you for the rest of your life. Please.
Thank you for being here. In his final days in office as Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates commented on the future of NATO and the disproportionate responsibility that is borne by the United States. I was wondering if you could give an assessment of the future of NATO in both the short and long term.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you. That's a great question. And I would tell you, I have been, when I was a brigadier, I had the NATO desk on the Joint Staff. And I was there at the 50th anniversary of NATO, where the presidents of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary stood up there and in their 3 minutes they were allocated to speak, talked about what it meant to them and talked about the impact of being part of a democratic alliance had on them personally in their countries. I mean, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. And then I worked with them in the Balkans, in Bosnia and Kosovo. And I started getting less patient with the political nature of things, especially on the military side. And then in Iraq, when I had to deal with the NATO training mission, that was helpful, but was probably, I don't know, 5% of the overall military training effort. And I spent 30% of my time working on the NATO side for that 5% than I did on the other stuff. And I got frustrated by that, and so that I started not liking NATO very much. Where is it headed? They are leaning on us. I mean, you look at what they're spending on defense, it's a shame. But they don't, their populations don't feel threatened to a large degree, and so they're not investing in that. Now, when I was a fellow, I was about a lieutenant colonel, I was a fellow. I did a fellowship at the Atlantic Council, which is the NATO support group here in the United States. And one of the former NATO ambassadors says NATO's demise is predicted every 17 years. And it's been that way throughout the course of its history. It always was a political alliance, It is, but it had a good integrated military structure. I think we're moving to the point where it's going to be more like the EU than it is like the NATO that I certainly grew up with. It's good. It may be a very useful political alliance. I don't know how much longer the integrated military structure can hold without the investment in it. Now, that said, they're working shoulder and shoulder with each other in Afghanistan every day, and that will have a long-term impact on the military relationship. So it'll be longer, I think, before that change takes place. It's kind of a long, rambling answer, but yeah. There, and then back there. Go ahead.
John Harrison, first year security student here. Served in Iraq twice as an Air Force liaison officer for the 10th Mountain Division and 1st Infantry Division.
Good for you.
And one of the things that I really learned in serving with the Army is how Army leadership has a very can-do attitude and a willingness to adapt and exercise resourcefulness to accomplish the mission in spite of how difficult the situation might be that confronts you. So what I'd like to ask is, with respect to the decision to go into Iraq, at any point in the lead up to the invasion or while you were overseeing operations there, did you ever feel that your civilian leadership had handed you really an impossible situation?
No. And the military leadership, the chairman had the opportunity to provide military advice to the Secretary of Defense and the President. Tommy Franks had the opportunity to provide military advice to the President. I read the intelligence on the weapons of mass destruction. I believe there were weapons of mass destruction there. And I will tell you there were. I mean, not in the numbers that we thought, but I mean, I was buying rockets with nerve agent in them from peasants who'd find, farmers who'd find them in their fields. So there was stuff that was out there, but obviously not in the scope that we thought. So the answer to your question is no. I didn't feel like we were handed for the decision to go to war, we were handed a mess. Now, what happened after that, and the decision to disband the Army and the debathification decisions, those were two decisions that had long-term negative impacts on our ability to move Iraq in the direction we wanted it to go as rapidly as we could. And I'll tell you just an observation. The other thing is, there was a lot of criticism of the administration in the run-up to the ground war for tinkering with Tommy Franks' plan, the military plan. And what I saw, this is my impression, okay? I think it might have been a little gun-shy by that, so they kind of said, okay, Casey, you go, tell us what you think we ought to do. Which isn't exactly a great position for a military leader to be in. So, but anyway, in the run-up to the ground war, the answer to your question is no. As we went on, there were some things that didn't help us. Yes, please.
I have sort of a multi-part question about Israel and Palestine. With the most recent round of talks sort of ending unsuccessfully, do you see within, not even the near future, but, you know, within our lifetime sometime, a peace being brokered between Israel and Palestine as far as Palestinian statehood? And if you don't think that's going to happen, do you think it is important that Palestine be recognized as a state through the UN, which they obviously have some support for, especially in the Middle East and in Europe?
Mm. What does Tom Friedman say? He said, if you're going to broker Middle East peace, you have to be part obstetrician. You have to figure out whether they've decided they want to get pregnant yet. I don't think they're ready to get pregnant with the peace treaty again. But I can't. It'll turn so quickly based on a leader. I mean, look what Sadat did, and what he was able to accomplish just by that single. It's oversimplification. The single gesture of going to Jerusalem. I mean, that could happen tomorrow. We were talking earlier with Bob Coombs, and I think Abbas had to go to the UN and put that request for statehood on the table. He had to do it. When you're negotiating with someone on settlements, I read something in the paper that talked about the Palestinians. The way they look at it is, it's like ordering a pizza with someone, and while you're discussing how you're going to divide the pizza, the other person's eating the pizza. So I don't know what the catalyst, the breakthrough catalyst, is going to be, and I don't know if it's even possible for it to happen anytime soon, because I don't think they're ready. So I guess you can put me down as pessimistic to see something happen there in the next 5 years or so. There and then there.
When I read Woodward's book, Obama's Wars, one of the things that struck me was how much various people in the Army, like McChrystal, like Petraeus, could call senators. I was surprised by the amount of connections and friendships that exist between military leaders and high-ranking, politicians. In your experience, how does that come about? Do you have a list of senators that you can call on your favorites? Or?
No, what happens is, over time, you build relationships. And frankly, we tell our young officers, you need to go out and build relationships with people in the media and people on the Hill. I was, as lieutenant colonel, I was in our Office of Legislative Liaison in the Army. Now, that horrified people, because that was, the way we used to think about legislative affairs in the Army was, boy, you held your nose when you had to do that, And, but I started building experiences in relationships with staff and members there that served me well when I was Chief of Staff of the Army. Jack Murtha, God rest his soul, I've known since I was lieutenant colonel. When they wanted to cut $400 billion off an Army program, I called him up and said, Jack, the cuts are too deep. He said, how much can you stand? I said, 200. He said, fine. But that's the kind of thing that you build over time, and we actively encourage folks to do that. I haven't read the book, so I don't know the specifics of what they were doing. I mean, the thing I worry about is military leaders actively influencing policy, and that's not our job. You know, we inform political leaders about the military implications of the policy. And a lot of folks thought I wasn't for Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It's not my job to be for or against Don't Ask, Don't Tell. My job was to get the military impacts of that on the table. And once I did that at the hearing, thank you very much, tell me what you want me to do, and we'll move out. So I worry about that. I worry about, there's a line there. And frankly, it's a personal line. Different people feel like they can go further than others. But I firmly believe that military leaders shouldn't be involved in influencing or selling policy. That's the political leader's job to do. There you go. I'm sorry, you and then you.
You mentioned the transformation of the military, which you guys as chief of staff. Where do you see the Army in 10 years? Still a problem with the tank mafia, still engaged, buying too expensive weapons that they may not be using in the current conflict, etc.
Yeah, I think we have been preparing ourselves for this budget turn down for the last 3 years I was Chief of Staff of the Army. It's so predictable. If you go back and graph out the defense budget for World War II, it's almost symmetrical. And you have these 10-year spikes, little plateau, 10-year valley, little plateau, and that's the way it goes. Now, we're in a downturn, and we're going to be in a downturn for probably another decade unless something very significant happens. And that's the way it is. And so, you know, we've been at war for a decade, and we know what capabilities we're using and what capabilities we're not using. And in fact, the last 8 months or so I was in the job, I had our guys that do this go through and look at every different type of function in the Army and look at the structure, look at what was in the active force, look at what was in the Guard, look at what was in reserve, and see what we were using and what we weren't. And we're going to have to get smaller. There's no question about it. And our bias, it's not just the Army and all the services, we'll want to keep our end strength high, or the number of people that we have in the service high. But you know what's going on with personnel costs, not just in the military, but all over the place. So when we do that, we lock ourselves into high personnel costs, and then the cost of training that large number of people, equipping that large number of people, and that's where you start getting hollow. And so what we told ourselves we needed to do is once we saw it coming, we need to go out and we need to design a smaller, more versatile and rapidly deployable Army that we could equip well, sustain well, and support well. And that's what they're trying to do. But I worry that we'll get fixed on the number of troops in the Army, and we'll try to keep that number at a level we can't afford, and you'll have the hollowing effect that'll come out after that.
With regard to what you said about how the military officers shouldn't be involved in policy, I was wondering if you had any insight into the situation of the Egyptian military based in the U.S.
I ran into the Egyptian Army attaché at the Chief of Naval Operations retirement ceremony, and I was standing there with General Odierno, and we got him over. I said, look, you need to tell Tentawe and General Anand, give it back as fast as you can. I said, General Odierno and I have been involved in trying to build democracy in an Arab country. Give it to the civilians. The military doesn't do well in this. Now, you know, I don't know what they're wrestling with. I know they feel the need to maintain security, but boy, I would tell them have those elections as early as you could do it and get the civilians in charge and get back to the security business. You know, there's some things we do well and there's other things we don't do so well. Arthur. Thank you. Nice to see you. Arthur has really aged well. And he looked that way 30 years ago.
I wonder if you could say a few words about David Petraeus. In particular, he has become such
yet he has his critics. I think particularly of Ambassador who does not like his doctrines and thinks that he's ruining the Army by asking it to do tasks it's not suited for. And we were both something of important figures in the war in Iraq. And I wonder if you could share your views of, not so much David Petraeus the man, but what his doctrines are and where they might take us in terms of the United States military implementation.
Yeah, okay. First, he is a very, very capable officer and leader, and what he did in Iraq was remarkable. I mean, I told him when we had our little session together as we were changing, I said, David, there's only one other person in the world that knows how hard what you're getting ready to do is, and that's me, and I'll do anything I can to help you. And so I think he just did an absolutely remarkable job. Now, certainly he has been influential in how we have transformed the Army. But and he was mostly influential from his time as a 3-star when he was at our Fort Leavenworth, where he wrote the counterinsurgency doctrine with Jim Mattis of the Marine Corps. But that was a doctrine that the Army bought into. And as you might have taken from my comments earlier, the types of conflicts we're going to be involved in the 21st century will not necessarily lend themselves to resolution by exclusively military means, because you're dealing with people's needs, both needs in terms of government and economics and security. And so I think there's a difference between what it takes to start building those capabilities to enhance the security efforts and nation building. When John Negroponte and I went into Iraq and we were trying to figure out, okay, what do we want the end state to be? Where do we want this to come out? And we purposely tried to minimize. I'm going to say minimize isn't the right word. But we tried not to over-optimize what we were trying to accomplish there. And we said representative government and security forces that could maintain domestic order and keep the terrorists out. We figured if we could do those 3 things, we could look ourselves in the mirror and say, okay, we've done that. That didn't say anything about building an economy, although you had to do some of that. And the same applies to Afghanistan. And I don't know that, once he went to Iraq, he didn't necessarily influence what was going on in the Army. And while we watched what happened over there, I think I'm actually doing on a report, my own report on Iraq to give into the guys like Rainey here. They're going to be doing this in 10 years, so they can read it and understand what we saw and what we did. And I think we need to look not only at Dave's period there, but at the whole period. Because there's, when you get these books like the Woodward book, you have this kind of, conventional view of what's going on. And it's not history. It's just the guy that got the book out there first. And I think we all, as professionals, need to look hard at that and to study that and figure out what really right is. I feel pretty comfortable where Army doctrine is. I took a big hand in it when I got back from Iraq. And it talks about integrating political and economic and information skills into our overall operations. But I believe it stops well short of what you would call nation building.
Sir, Major Joe Thomas, just to kind of follow up on that, would you say that there's a role from a whole of government standpoint, or maybe an expeditionary USAID type force to do those capabilities, enhancing foreign countries, or institution building? Not necessarily nation building, but institution building, sir?
There's a Washington think tank guy, Andy Krepanevich, who does a lot of futures work. And when he talks about whole of government, he talks about HOLE. The short answer is yes, but we've been talking about this since Bosnia. And everyone said, well, we don't really want to invest in that because we're never going to have to do it again. And we absolutely could benefit from that, particularly on the rule of law and the police side. To me, those two areas are, they're probably, in my view, the most important tools to effectively transition from a military operation to a civil operation, and they are the hardest ones to establish in a foreign country. And I told President Bush, the world sucks at police, and we really do. And I've watched firsthand in Bosnia, in Kosovo, and in Iraq. And it's really unfortunate. So yes, I think we could benefit from that. I think if you look at what I just said about where the budget's going, people are going to be very reluctant to take on new things. But this is a good example about something that could well serve us well in the future, that we need to do at the expense of old things that aren't going to help us very much down the road. Speaking of old things that aren't going to help us much down the road, you talked about the tank. We're having trouble with the tank force. We're not necessarily having trouble inside the Army, but I played hell convincing Secretary Gates that we weren't trying to sneak back to the Fulda Gap as soon as we get out of Iraq. In fact, I said that to him. Mr. Secretary, I said, I don't know what I need to do to convince you. But most of the Army 4-stars have served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and a lot of them 2 and 3 times. They understand the environment we're operating in. And what I see happening is it's the younger officers who've done nothing but Iraq and Afghanistan, who haven't led their tank company, who haven't fired their artillery battery. They're the ones that want to get back and, they're professionals. They want to get back and say, oh, hey, I can do this now. I'm whole, and I'm ready to move on. But I think I believe of all the services, the Army has undergone the most fundamental change of anybody. And we have a way to go, still. But that's where we are. And everybody needs to continue to change and adapt. And when the likelihood of state-on-state conflict is fairly low, and the budgets are going down, how much are you going to invest on systems that only benefit you in state-on-state conflict? I hope not a lot. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for speaking with us and for your service. My question touches upon military relations that we were talking about earlier, and also on the transformation within the war that you had to undergo from your previous training. Do you feel, or could you speak to how training exercises with other militaries are going at this point? Do you feel that we're doing adequate training exercises? Are we hitting the mark as to where we need to be for the challenges you see us facing in the coming 10 years, and for challenges that we might not be able to exactly predict right now?
Candidly, we have not been doing much multinational training. The training that we have been doing has largely been in Japan and in Korea. And elsewhere, and we're doing a little bit at NATO, but we're fighting with them every day. And so we're actually very, very capable of operating with our NATO allies. We've been there a decade, and so folks are getting fairly comfortable with that. Where you're taking it is, though, okay, when we're out of Iraq, we draw down in Afghanistan, how do you sustain that knowledge? And how do you sustain that knowledge with countries that aren't willing to invest in defense to the point that will allow their soldiers and sailors, airmen, and Marines to go out and do those kinds of things? And I think that's going to be a real challenge. But we are pretty good at operating as multinational forces. Again, we've been doing it for 10 years with particularly with our NATO allies and some non-NATO allies who have been there in Iraq and been there in Afghanistan. What?
Mongolians.
Yeah, the Mongolians. They used to come. They used to bring me all these weird animal horns. Please.
Sir, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the future of Army leadership. When I was in the Army, when I look around now, all the best officers I served with are gotten out.
you hear that, Rainey? Yeah.
But I'm just wondering, is the Army doing anything to try and retain, I mean, I know they are, I know, because I was part of the whole, police stay for $35,000.
When did you get out?
Last year.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when I look around, I mean, I would not want to go back in the Army and serve under most of the officers that are still there. Just because, I mean, for whatever reason, those are the ones who stayed and the best guys got out. I'm just
Yeah.
wondering if,
I mean, I have no doubt that your anecdotes there are real to you. I don't see it across the whole Army. There are leaders out there that aren't great, but they're combat seasoned. And you know, we have as you know, we have a fairly robust leader development program. The other thing I'd tell you is one of the things we did to look at ourselves after a decade at war, because you don't stay at war for a decade without undergoing profound change as an institution. And we started asking ourselves, what's happened to the Army institutionally after a decade at war? Are we still a professional organization? What elements of our culture have changed? Have they changed in a positive way or changed in a negative way? And our Training and Doctrine Command, which looks at these kind of things, was given the charter to take an Army-wide look at this over the course of the year. Because I hear the stories about toxic leadership, just like you do. And candidly, I saw leaders in Iraq, some at a high level, that were more concerned about making a mistake than they were taking a risk to accomplish something significant. You know, we're human just like everybody else. So I think we're taking a hard look at ourselves to try to learn the impacts of the last decade at war. And I think you'll see some changes to our officer efficiency report and to our leader development programs to try to take into account those concerns. But I don't, again, I have no doubt of what you're saying about the leaders that you came in contact with. Army-wide, I don't see that. I don't see that all the good guys are getting out and all the mediocre folks are staying. I didn't see it.
I have a question regarding the drone program. The Obama administration seems to have adopted it as a primary source of counterterrorism strategy.
Can you just kind of slow down to maybe 45 RPMs?
About the drone program, the Obama administration has adopted it as the primary strategy for dealing with
I'm sorry, what program?
the drones.
The drone program, okay.
And they've expanded into Yemen and Somalia. And the program seems to be focused on successes, and they're getting those successes. Or are they looking at the ramifications of those successes, what it's doing to radicalization? And are they also thinking about what happens when China, Russia, and Israel get these type of capabilities and start doing it in other nations as well?
I will tell you, before I left the Army, I did not hear any discussion about what if other countries got this capability and began using it at all. So that last part there I didn't get. I know that, you know, having used that and I don't want to say developed it, but worked at it in its early stages with General McChrystal, it's a tough call. I mean, what happened is, you know, I don't think I'm getting classified here, but you can imagine, you have a plane up there that is looking at the ground through a straw. I mean, people have a misperception that they think when you're up that high you can see everything. You can't. It's like looking at the ground through a straw. But if you're tracking a person, you can follow that car all over the place. And you might lose it in traffic occasionally, but you go back and you pick it up again. And then they talk on the phones. And so you match the two together. And if you track them for a couple of days, you know they go to this house and this house. And then one night you see at this house he's been before, 10 cars show up. And then you get a cell phone hit that says, hey, we're having a meeting. And so-and-so and so-and-so are here. And so you start making some calculations. How sure are you of the information? What else do you see around there? What type of collateral damage would you expect? If it's in a city, I mean, there's models that the Air Force runs. And if the collateral damage in terms of lives exceeded a certain level, I had to call Secretary Rumsfeld to get approval for it. And it was low. So, I mean, we don't go at this willy-nilly, and I'm sure the CIA has carried that on. I mean, it's those decisions about the cost-benefit decisions are made on every mission. And you know, you've all seen the stuff from Afghanistan about civilian casualties and what General McChrystal did to try to drive those down. It's a cost-benefit judgment that is made all the time by our leaders. What's the risk to our troops? What's the likelihood you're going to get the guy that you're after? What's the impact of collateral damage? And folks are doing that out there, not just with drones, but with artillery fire and mortar fire and every day. And they all know that creating more civilian casualties hurts us in the long run. And so you got to be very careful with how you do it. And I saw our guys take some very significant risks to themselves to avoid not hurting Iraqi civilians. Way back.
Some recent polls have showed that American standing in the Arab world is at an all-time low, and that some of these populations are even looking at Iran more favorably than the United States. And I was just wondering if you think this is true, and what can the U.S. do to change this trend?
I'm not sure whether I'd agree to thinking Iran is more popular than the United States in the Middle East. But I have no doubt that the United States is not very popular with the populations of the Middle East. I think that's right. I couldn't say whether it's 40%, 50%, or 60%. But that seems true to me. And I think that's a combination of what's been going on in Iraq and Afghanistan and how that has been manipulated by the terrorist organizations and used against us. And that is a long-term challenge. That said, Iraq is moving forward and I believe is well on its way to being an established democracy smack in the center of the Middle East. And I believe that that will have long-term implications for the broader Middle East. And again, we were talking earlier. Now, the Iraqis, this is probably not fair to say, but they may never express their gratitude for what's happened in ways that we would think would be appropriate. But their society and their country will have benefited hugely from what the United States has done there. And I think in the next decade or so, people will see that and they'll come to realize it. But what happened, it's interesting. If you look at Germany, when I left Germany in 2001, I actually moved my headquarters out of this German town that had been in for 50 years. So they had a big parade on the sports plots, and we marched back through town. But it was just the old people that remembered. The young folks had no connection to it. And so by the time Iraq is successful, you're going to have probably two generations of Iraqis who don't even remember the United States was there. So, I mean, these things, it's generational change that has to happen here. Karen.
We're glad you're back, first of all. Welcome.
Thank you.
I have a kind of a major question for you. Your pillar of persistent conflict, which you've explicated quite clearly this afternoon. Let's look at the flip side for a minute. Conflict resolution. What is the Army doing with respect to training and behavior along the lines of conflict resolution? And what do you think would be possible in this era of persistent conflict, which you see to be the future?
That's interesting. At the tactical level, I think our officers are very adept at small-scale conflict resolution because they do it every day. And those young leaders are going to grow up and be major leaders who are adept at doing that. But at a more strategic level, I can't say that during the time I was Chief of Staff of the Army, I was focusing Fort Leavenworth or the Army War College explicitly on conflict resolution. If we were doing anything, it was more on conflict prevention. How do you stop some of these conflicts getting to the point where they're a conflict that could have regional or global implications? And I think that is something where continuous engagement, the relationship building between armies, we can have a very positive impact on that over time. But I need to send more folks here to take How Wars End.
General, I'm going to go for the always dangerous last question here. Is there a last question? Debbie Avon?
Okay, yeah. Let me just first add my thanks to you for being here. But then I want to ask you about contractors. And not contractors in Iraq, but as you move forward, you're painting a picture of a dangerous world, a smaller military.
I agree.
Contractors, if anything, buy you flexibility. You don't know what's going to happen. And yet, the kinds of things that you're concerned about are also really intricate, complicated missions, where often using contractors is problematic. And so I just wondered what your reflections are and what you think the Army is doing.
Yeah, very interesting. I kind of divide contractors into two large groups. Logistical contractors, and they do a wonderful job, and I think we're gonna have to continue to rely on them because we're not going to be able to grow the logistical force structure in the armed forces if we're gonna get smaller. So we're going to have to do that. The second bin is what I'd call security contractors, and not just the ones that provide close-in security for diplomats, but folks that help us with messaging, for example. And I got into a lot of friction there with hiring contractors to help us write editorials for Iraqi newspapers. But hiring an Iraqi to write an editorial for an Iraqi newspaper is a heck of a lot better than having someone from Bayonne, New Jersey, who doesn't understand the culture writing it. So you're right, they do give us great flexibility to do that. But I think to your point, we have to watch the second bin a heck of a lot more carefully than we do the first bin in getting into areas where it could be problematic. I mean, you see some stuff on the intelligence contractors that overstep their bounds, and that just has to be watched very, very carefully. We talk about the size of the military. When people say, how big should the Army be? I said, okay, what's the budget? How much can we rely on contractors? And how much can we rely on the Guard and Reserve? But all those things have to come together to figure out what size the Army ought to be.
General, you've
Chris.
been very generous with your time, and we just want to thank you so much, and I think everyone will join me in a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. I never looked this young, did I, Arthur or Karen?